recherche, mais également au niveau personnel, car il parle un français éloquent, très élevé, un des rares anglicistes en Allemagne. But he decided to speak to you today in English. I think that's really nice for those of us, for you over there who don't speak French. Really great. So, well, we have a plurilingual morning this morning.
Okay. Merci bien de tes fleurs, chère Christiane. Donc, I will speak in English, in the international language, obviously. And I'll be readdressing some of the points that have been mentioned in the last couple of days, but I'll be addressing them from a slightly different angle, which is A, historical angle, B, a political angle, and 3A, in the third place, a didactical angle, trying to reconcile, as the title is, European language politics and linguistic realities in a world of globalization. I'll be, now let me get the technique all right. I'll be going back to the beginnings of the ECs, the European communities, and have a brief look at the Europe des patries, the Europe of fatherlands. Then we'll be reviewing Britain joining the ECs in 1973, with English becoming a langue communautaire, and we'll have a look at the role of English in Europe. After that, we'll be having a brief look at the age of devolution from the Europe of fatherlands, going from the Europe of fatherlands to the Europe of regions, l'Europe des régions, looking at the 1980s and 90s. We'll be talking about regionalization, plurilingualism, and uttering some criticism when it comes to the 1996 EU document on teaching and learning, the arguments of which are, I would say, strangely archaic. We must review the aftermath of this, counterproductive foreign language syllabi in the educational field all over Europe, and the advent of an age of globalization. Now, the second part of my talk will be action-oriented. We'll be looking at the communicative needs of young Europeans in a globalized world and the so-called global learning. The role of English as first foreign language and the language of globalization. We'll have a look at the, we'll be addressing 4 principles of teaching English, 4 novel principles of teaching English as a gateway to languages, and finding out how we can teach the langue communautaire by making use of an extended concept of language awareness and language learning competence, partial skills and intercomprehension, intercomprehension. And in the end, there'll be a short few sentences just about the lifelong learning and the learning of non-European languages. And if we have time at the end, I'll be showing you some ways, because I've been experimenting in this field in the foreign language classroom, of how we can teach English in a new way, turning it into a gateway to languages in general. So the last bit will be rather practically oriented. In his famous speech at the University of Zurich in 1946, Winston Churchill had argued that the European family should be recreated, in his own words, in a regional structure under and within the concept of the United Nations. The structure should be called, it may be, the United States of Europe. This is a quotation. Churchill had asked for a Council of Europe to be established, and he had finished his propositions by exclaiming, no, sorry, that's the wrong one. In all this urgent work of bringing the European family back to life, France and Germany must take the lead together. Great Britain, the British Commonwealth of Nations, mighty America, and I trust the Soviet Union, and then indeed all would be well, must be the friends and sponsors of Europe and must championate its right to live and shine. And therefore I say to you, let Europe arise. A prophetic phrase pronounced by a person from the United Kingdom. In Churchill's concept, Great Britain was going to be a friend and sponsor of Europe, not a member. With the Treaty of Rome of 1957, Europe indeed arose, a bit like a frail little phoenix, not as a proud bird, obviously, not as a union, but as a set of communities. Britain was not part of it, and English was not a langue communautaire. The four languages were, in alphabetic order, Dutch, French, German, and Italian. French, obviously, was in a leading position since it was spoken in parts of Belgium, la Wallonie, and Luxembourg, since Letzeborgisch did not have the status of a national language. Dutch was considered a less widely spoken language, a langue modime. Italian was a former enemy language, and German, the language of Nazi aggression and the Holocaust, had not recovered from its deepest fall in history. So French was in a splendid position, especially so since, who wonders, all the major centers of power within the new community were French-speaking. The French border city of Strasbourg, in those days still very much of a bastion de l'Est. Bruxelles, more French-speaking in those days than today, and Luxembourg, a city where in those days French was the language of administration and transnational contacts, undoubtedly, German being an idiom that everybody understood, but nobody was willing to speak for obvious reasons. The world has changed in the last 60 years. Luxembourg has become a polylingual city, a spiritual link, if you like, between France and Germany, tricultural basically, and a powerful regional capital. And Luxembourg, of course, is trilingual today, with French and German at almost equal footing, and with a national language of its own, which is fairly easy to understand for Germans from the Rhineland, such as myself, since it belongs to the same group of dialect. It is an autonomous dialect of German, a national language. After 1959, the French president, Charles de Gaulle, created the formula of a Europe of fatherlands, l'Europe des patries. A fatherland, in his eyes, was a nation state with a national language. The idea fitted in with his perception of contemporary France, which was a centralized state with officially just one language. However, it didn't fit in with the rest of the EC countries. Never mind, it helped to further strengthen the position of French, which was now within the EC of the early 1960s, an unquestioned national language, an international language spoken in 3 member states, and the unofficial language of European administration and diplomacy, a field in which France, between 1648, the Münster peace talks, and 1919, Versailles, had played a leading role. With regard to French interests, heaving French into a strong European position was important, since the role of French both as a truly international and post-colonial language worldwide was dwindling, with negative effects also on French as a foreign language in education internationally. When in the aftermath of the Cultural Revolution of 1968, French as the sole vehicle of cultures existing in France came under attack by regionalist movements, Georges Pompidou, then Prime Minister, declared in 1972 Il n'y a pas de place pour les langues et cultures régionales ou minoritaires dans une France qui doit marquer l'Europe de son sceau. He proved to be mistaken. Et d'ailleurs, la parole de M. Pompidou démontre une façon de penser, on dirait aujourd'hui, qui n'est ni démocratique ni communautaire, un peu euro-chauviniste peut-être. In the tradition of Churchill's 1946 prophecy, Britain had abstained from taking part in the Rome negotiations of 1957. 4 years later, however, in 1961, the British Prime Minister, Macmillan, formally applied for EC membership. His request was vetoed by Charles de Gaulle, who argued that Britain was, quote, insular and maritime, and set apart by habits and traditions. He also accused Britain of being too close to America. The same happened again when a Labour government under its Prime Minister Wilson submitted a second application in 1967. Only after the French president stepping down in 1969 became it possible for the United Kingdom to join the EC. In 1972, the Westminster Parliament ratified the European Communities Act, and Britain became an EC member in 1973, this decision being confirmed in 1975 by a referendum with a majority of no less than 67%. Britain's accession dramatically changed the linguistic balance of the European community. And the change was actually documented by the German cultural institution, the Goethe Institute. It is a famous document, very, very interesting to read, even after for almost 40 years, you know. English, the international language per se of the Western world, was now, in the tradition of Charles de Gaulle, a national language within the European community. And more than that, it was the second national language of Ireland, and a language with interesting European friends and allies, such as Denmark. Ireland and Denmark having joined the European community simultaneously with Britain. And somewhat later, Sweden, Finland, Portugal, the Baltic states, Malta, and Cyprus. A new communicative network established itself in Europe based on English rather than on any other language. In the course of the 1980s and 90s, Germany and the Netherlands became part of it. The Munich professor Harald Weinrich, a famous linguist at home both in France and Germany, stated that the friendship between France and Germany, established after the Second World War and the very basis of the European unification, was now going to be une amitié muette, a mute friendship, which unfortunately it is nowadays. Right from its start, both the Council of Europe and the European communities had held that a united Europe was not going to be a linguistic replica of the United States of America. Europe was ethnically and culturally different. There were no empty spaces for settlers from all over the world to come to. Obviously, there are now. Regional and national languages and cultures had existed in Europe for thousands of years. And in spite of nationalism and warfare, there was such thing as a common European culture, as Churchill had expressed it in 1946, in literature, in music, in the arts, in architecture, and, of course, in religion. Nation building, in the American sense, was no option. A monolingual and monocultural e pluribus unum, the motto on US coins, was not to be desired, not least because of the fact that a European monolingualism, monoculturalism, would endanger the interior stability of the new community. After all, forcing people to abandon their national or regional languages and consequently their cultures can trigger off civil warfare, as dozens of European and actually post-1945 examples show. For instance, the war in Yugoslavia. In the early 1960s, the Council of Europe had argued that the existing multilingualism in Europe should be considered as riches and not as an obstacle to unity. The programmatic slogan developed from this became plurilingual European citizens for a multilingual Europe. In 1969, the Council of Europe propagated the idea of a receptive multilingualism in Europe based on the fact that most European languages, both regional and national, are more or less closely related. The idea was taken up as part of a possible solution of the European language problem by a number of academics, especially and in Germany. For instance, Freyo Meissner and my glorious self also, who started researching the new didactic challenge. But the educational systems did not comply. They went on the old way. Both for grammar translation-oriented traditionalists and the addicts of pattern practice, the American approach, the new approach was too revolutionary. Finally, in 1996, the European Commission, Brussels, not Strasbourg, published its white book, Enseigner et apprendre, vers la société cognitive. The fourth general aim proposed was, and I quote from the French version, maîtriser trois langues communautaires. The introductory text reads as follows. That's it? Yes. La maîtrise de plusieurs langues communautaires est devenue une condition indispensable pour permettre aux citoyens de l'Union de bénéficier des possibilités professionnelles et personnelles que leur ouvre la réalisation du grand marché intérieur sans frontières. Cette capacité linguistique doit se doubler d'une faculté d'adaptation à des milieux de travail et de vie marqués par des cultures différentes. In spite of the fact that the Council of Europe had, in the meantime, successfully worked towards grading communicative competencies, that it had created a threshold level, and that the common framework was well on its way, the 1996 document of the European Commission does not mention partial competencies, it does not mention graded competencies. All it does is talk about maîtriser une langue, which is a very old-fashioned concept. Either you know a language or you don't. In fact, given the standard of 2015, this is a Stone Age view of language learning. Another important point, what is to be understood by plusieurs langues communautaires? In 1991, the Council of Europe had ratified the European Charter for Regional and Minority Languages. As we've seen, the regional challenge had been on the European political agenda ever since the late 1960s. Europe had seen a growing trend in regionalization, devolution, ever since the early 70s, away from the old idea of l'Europe des nations and evolving towards une Europe des régions. In 1985, an association of the regions of Europe had been founded, and the Treaty of Maastricht of 1992 had included the formation of a committee of regions as an advisory council of the European Commission. In the 1996 document, there is no statement as to the status of regional languages in plurilingual language learning, though the question of a great interest in the field of, though this question is of great interest in the field of curriculum planning. Furthermore, there is only a very vague reference in the document as to the role of cultures when it comes to selecting a language for closer study, and border competence, la compétence transfrontalière, is not mentioned at all. This in spite of the fact that in the context of a regionalized Europe, this particular competence, la compétence transfrontalière, consisting of linguistic and cultural components and communicative strategies within a framework of partial skills, is of paramount importance. After all, the linguistic and cultural borders in a regionalized Europe are at least 10 times as long as in the old type of l'Europe des patries. The 1996 document is, however, explicit about the fact that plurilingualism implies competencies in at least 3 languages, thus un trilinguisme. Because of this, plurilingualism cannot be defined by the cheap formula of our national educational systems, which is national language plus English, or in Britain, national language plus French. This, at least, is a good point. However, the general reason given in the document for the study of languages is surprisingly one-sided, very much directed towards functioning correctly in a common market without toll barriers. Evidently, there is a lot more to language and cultural learning and to becoming trilingual than just that. The 1996 document, therefore, in spite of its grand title, is not a masterpiece. No wonder, therefore, that in the years afterwards, its basic linguistic goal, trilingualism as a minimum requirement, was rated as utopian by most educational authorities in the member states, since it was misunderstood as an extended new edition of the old bourgeois demand of 2 foreign languages, national languages, for every cultivated being. Too many questions remained open. How about other important languages, such as Russian, Arabic, or Chinese? And since the EU learner was given the right to choose his languages, where should all these idioms be offered? And how and when? In the end, by 2010, it was clear that the paper had been counterproductive rather than productive. Since its goals were considered vague and beyond political reach, educational authorities all over Europe had in the meantime cut back on language education even further, reducing foreign language teaching, even at grammar school level, to a subject called Fremdsprache in German, foreign language, which was a mere synonym for English. Can a plurilingualism in the EU sense of 1996 continue to be officially considered as an acceptable, though maybe long-term goal? And can it provide a comprehensive answer to the communicative needs of the European citizen of the globalized age? The answer is, I think, no. Major modifications, additions, and clarifications are needed, which can be introduced thanks to the excellent work of the Council of Europe in the last 20 years, and also thanks to the great advances in the field of applied linguistics, foreign language didactics, and cognitive psychology. What are then the principles of the new approach? 4 principles. First principle, let us be honest with each other when planning the linguistic and cultural well-being of the next generations. Language politics may be a legitimate domain of both home and foreign policy, but there should be no place for implicit political power plays when the communicative future of Europe and of the next generations of Europeans is at stake. In this sense, the early European community has given a bad example, since in their language politics, there was too much of a double entendre, too much of this kind of implicit power play. Understandably, perhaps, in those days, because of ancient traditions, going back to Vieille Cotteret, if you like, and also because of the fear of a far-reaching Americanization of Europe in the context of the Cold War. Let's be honest. Second principle, let us take into account that the young Europeans of today live in a globalized world. Their communicative perspectives, aspirations and needs go far beyond the European Union. And this trend will continue and become even more prominent in the decades to come. And this is why all language and cultural learning in Europe should be regarded both under a European, an interior, if you like, and a global, an exterior angle. Of course, trying to learn neighboring languages, and all European languages are neighboring languages, since the language furthest away from the center of power, wherever that be, Brussels perhaps, is only a couple of hours by plane away from it. Trying to learn neighboring languages may seem difficult to some of our school kids and adults, yet, to the exception perhaps of Basque, the Finno-Ugrian languages and Turkish, learning these languages is tremendously less strenuous than learning Eastern Asian languages like Chinese or Japanese, because the cultural concepts and the linguistic structures are so different of Chinese and Japanese are so different and sometimes hardly conceivable in our own categories, not to mention the script. The script is a very, very important factor. Let us bear in mind when we talk about the other languages, because we must go for a trilingualism, only a different one from the trilingualism of the 1996 document. Most European languages have the same script or a closely related one. You can learn the Russian script within 1 week. I know this because I did Russian at school, in the West actually. Most European languages have the same script or a closely related one, the same basic structures. They follow the same cultural concepts, which is very important. And they have been under similar influences also. This is very important. Of course, there are differences, both linguistically and culturally, but let us not look at them through a magnifying glass all the time. European languages have an awful lot in common. And this is something that we must not forget to teach. And let the parents know, actually. Third principle. Under global auspices, the undoubted international language is English. This may change, since so far international languages have had their entrances and their exits, to quote Shakespeare in a reversed way. But the position of English will not change within a short time span, evidently. English has also become the international language of the EU, let's face it. So let us study the role of English both as a European neighboring language and as an international tool inside and outside Europe, without the traditional bias of seeing in it a herald of cultural egalitarianism, or even worse, Americanization. Actually, my generation, the Germany of my age, was Americanized to a certain extent in the 1950s. And believe me, the contact with this nation of great good faith has done us an awful lot of good. We do need English, And English is everywhere. So why does the 1996 EC document not even mention the name of this functionally outstanding language? Is it that the authors did not want to touch the problem, since some people might take it amiss? Let us be honest with one another. Fourth principle. Our classrooms, both in France and Germany, if not all over Europe, are focal points of multi- and pluriculturalism, multi- and plurilingualism, and the mix of languages in them is global rather than European. Germany is just now receiving and trying to integrate 1 million refugees from Western Asian countries. So in fact, German classrooms will soon be mirroring a new and hitherto unknown facet of globalization, with hopefully A2 kids speaking English and German, but kids with a non-European mother tongue, yet truly trilingual. One of the deadly sins of the EC and EU language politics has been never to bother about linguistic and cultural immigration from outside. A development that Britain has seen from the 1950s onwards and very, very well coped with. Russian, for instance, is an important minority language in Germany, yet it is not a langue communautaire, nor is it a regional language in the traditional sense of the term. Does that mean that the EU does not have to bother? The same for Turkish, with 4 million co-inhabitants in Germany. Maybe the current migration of peoples will give Brussels a chance to think again. Let us bring foreign language learning in Europe closer to the actual communicative experience of the school kids in their classrooms and in their social surroundings. Let us start with what they experience and build motivation from there. And it is their motivation. They must develop it. We cannot develop it for them. Let us start with what they experience, knowing that there is very little motivation to be derived from grammar-oriented and sometimes pseudo-communicative and pseudo-realistic course books. How can this be achieved? What is feasible? And I would like to mention 6 points, 6 directives, if you like. First point. Let us continue to teach English as a first foreign language, as this is currently the case in most educational systems. English is the language that a growing number of kids have been in contact with before even coming to school. And they remain in contact with it after leaving it in the afternoon. English is the language they want to learn, take it or leave it. And English is, in most cases, the language that their parents want them to learn, or at least learn first and before they learn any other languages. But let us teach English in a different way, not as a self-propelled and self-fulfilling process facilitated by the teacher, but as a gateway to languages, une porte aux langues, which is actually a metaphor going back to the 17th century. Dverge języków otevřené. This is Czech. It means the opened door to languages. And this is Comenius, Komensky. With a special emphasis on a more general kind of language awareness, an awareness of the functioning of languages in the plural, and of the functioning of strategies and formats of communication. And this is where the actual multilingualism, multiculturalism in the classroom will come into play, as a reservoir of examples for comparison, and as an anchor point in the kids' personal learning grids and identity building. English is, as we all know, a mixed and a stratified language, a language of many origins. It has features in common with the Teutonic and the Romance languages, but also with Chinese, being an extreme case of an analytical language. It does not have a case system, but it has a very complicated prepositional system, just like Finno-Ugrian languages, only they have postpositions, not prepositions. Aspect is an important category in English grammar, just as in the Slavonic languages. And it has borrowed vocabulary from all over the place. So there is plenty of things to compare at all levels, to play round with. Many cooks spoil the broth was changed by punch into a superfluity of culinary assistance is apt to exercise a detrimental effect upon the consommé. Many cooks spoil the broth, the Teutonic phrase, the Germanic phrase, and then the posh pseudo phrase. A superfluity of culinary assistance is apt to exercise a detrimental effect upon the consommé. This can only be done with English, you see. Plus, of course, looking at the question of how communication functions linguistically, socially, culturally. Second point, the new classroom approach to English should be comparative rather than purely monolingual. It should work towards the perception of linguistic and cultural universals, parallels, and of course, idiosyncrasies, what is so-called typically English, and not restrict itself so much to traditional forms of grammar and grammatical rule learning. Mistakes in grammar are mostly slight mistakes, since they cause cognitive reactions. The bad mistakes are not grammatical, but cultural and pragmatic. We don't count them in our schools, do we? No. They cause affective reactions. And they cause communication breakdowns. Third point, all foreign languages should be taught in a functional rather than a formal way. Let us not ask as a first question, what is the grammatical form? How is it constructed? And what is the rule that goes with it? Such teaching is boring and out of touch with life. Rather, let us motivate the learners to find out about the communicative function of the grammatical phenomenon. What does the ing form in English stand for? Why does it exist? What does it convey? What communicative need does it cover? How do other languages in the classroom express the idea or deal with the particular communicative need? And you need the traduction interlinéaire for this, word by word, sometimes syllable by syllable, in order to understand. Because you don't know Turkish or Swahili or whatever. Fourth point, let us bring the notions of language, communication, and culture together wherever possible. Learning a language is not, first and foremost, learning a set of grammar rules and constructing or changing sentences. It is trying to communicate in a cultural setting. This is something completely different. Let us stop counting mistakes, since the number of mistakes is no proper indicator of communicative ability. The common framework does not count mistakes, does it? Not even in dictation writing. You look at it. Instead, it defines and describes levels of competence. Again, this is something completely different. Fifth point. Never find the key. Here we are. Let us develop cultural and linguistic curiosity in the learners as much as we can, and let us develop it in ourselves, because the majority of our teachers are not culturally and linguistically curious. Rather than establishing sediments of formal knowledge which the learners cannot transform properly when communicating, let us arouse their interest into the functioning of the language system and communicative strategies. Let us make them feel communicative success, and let us make them find out in a playful way what language is capable of. And the sixth point, let us discard traditional school ideologies, such as flawlessness as an ideal state of affairs. No communicative act or result is ever perfect, neither in one's own language nor in a foreign one. The modified approach proposed here will follow the young European citizens' linguistic and cultural experiences as closely as possible. It will create a network between English as the first foreign language and the languages to be learnt or acquired afterwards, turning the isolated efforts of mastering individual languages into one overall project. European citizens, as citizens all over the world, have two basic communicative needs. A, they want to be able to communicate worldwide, and B, they want to communicate regionally. If English is their worldwide tool, competencies in the language or languages of their neighborhood will be crucial with regard to the second need. This is why neighboring languages should be studied at school or acquired later in life within a model that allows for partial competencies and also takes into account that an A2 or B1 competence in a neighboring language may be quite enough, and that it is possibly more desirable for a person in a fairly multilingual setting to start off with a knowledge of 2 or 3 additional languages at a lower degree of competence than to excel in just one language. The curricular problem with this is that schools cannot offer a fairly limited number of, can only offer a fairly limited number of second, third or fourth languages. But there are ways of blended learning, etc., of going to evening classes, and some of our school kids do, in fact, go to language classes in the afternoon and the evening, so that I think we can cope with the problem. Moreover, the 1969 idea of the Council of Europe propagating a receptive multilingualism can be resuscitated, and it's about time this were done, really. On the basis described here, a fair number of neighboring languages in the European sense could be locally offered. Since English is and will remain the langue communautaire, a total of 2 or 3 EU languages could easily be studied at school by the average EU learner on their way to plurilingualism. A word about the non-European languages, a final word. We must get away from the latent Euro-chauvinist attitude of the 1996 paper. Languages such as Chinese, Japanese, Arabic, Indonesian, Brazilian, Russian, and of course African languages are heralds of mighty powers and their cultures, and they will have to be considered as school subjects, at least in certain defined areas and centers, or on a regional basis once this new or rather modified EU language learning policy has taken shape. Again, new modes of learning can be considered, and it's up to you to figure them out. There are a number of ways. Another question is whether the EU should not spend some money on fostering the upkeep of immigrant languages, be it along the Australian lines of intensive courses at specialized weekend language schools, or in a combination with evening classes, summer camps, etc. And then there is the question of institutionalizing, wherever we teach languages, a widened conception of language awareness, languages awareness, if you like, and of language learning competence. Language is our most intimate possession. We live in a world of many languages, and all of us are plurilingual, even those who do not speak a foreign language. They have their local and their social dialects. Through language, man can symbolically communicate, and through communication, man has created different local, regional, national cultures. The language topic is tremendously central, so why should we not build it into our language learning programs and profit from the insight and comparative knowledge gained? And these are some ways for you to read while I do the last few sentences here. The approach discussed in this paper has the potential of preparing the young generation of Europeans for the lifelong linguistic and cultural learning processes they will have to undergo, processes that may very well transcend the narrow confines of the major European language families, the historical, cultural, and linguistic frameworks of which are closely related anyhow, as we've seen, fortunately so, because this is the spiritual reason that brings us together, and not the common market, actually, as fellow Europeans from different regions with different tongues, and no longer as foreigners. Personally, I'd never call a Frenchman a foreigner. They are fellow Europeans from a different European region, full stop. In order to realize the modified approach, we need research teams to implement the new curricula, to find out what is feasible. We need politicians and school administrators willing to change things for the better. We need an adequate teacher training and in-service retraining of teachers to popularize the modes of thinking and methods implied. And we need modified teaching materials with more than just a grammatical progression, based sometimes on artificial, as I said, communicatively and culturally inadequate texts. But innovation in this field is a vast topic again, and a different matter. I've given you some hints to read because time's running out anyhow. So you just read these. These are things I've been trying to do as a teacher of English in Germany, teaching like language universals. This is very, very important. Any language has a tense system, but there is also the system of time, if I may say so. Aspects are a tremendously important thing across the languages, like perfective and imperfective, unmarked versus durative, iterative or intensive, etc. You know, you can talk about the general functioning of languages. All languages are man-made, or maybe given by the same God. But this is also the reason why they have more in common than what separates them. And we as language teachers have so far always looked at the uniqueness of our language, the language we teach. Let's look at the other languages as well and find out what they have in common. And this is exactly what you can do. Or, alternatively, ask yourselves and ask your kids, what is it actually that an educated person should know about language and languages? And a lot of things will come to your mind, actually. You can start tomorrow teaching this in your own classes. In what way does language, or do languages, affect the individual and society? And the other way around, in what way do humans affect language and languages by misusing languages and language, for instance? Well, danke fürs Zuhören. Thank you very much for listening. Merci bien de votre aimable attention. You take this one. No problem. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for your very interesting words and your how can I say, your clear position, clear and critical position that might be interesting enough for us to have just a few moments of a discussion. So it's time for your questions now. In English, in French, in German, as you like.
I'm so heartened by your talking about immigrant languages, regional languages, non-dominant European languages, Chinese, Arabic, Turkish. I mean, very often I don't hear that spoken about, particularly in conferences in Europe. I feel like the only voice who's bringing those issues up. But in the U.S., most of our discussion is surrounds bilingual education for immigrant children. So we talk about the child's mother tongue, home language, being the gateway into English. And you're talking about English being the gateway into other languages. And this is, whenever I try to transpose what we've done in the US for like 50 years onto a European landscape, there's always, English is like the elephant in the room. It's there and you have to deal with it. So in what sequence would you suggest teaching languages? First, the national language, because it's necessary.
Well, they go parallel, more or less, you know. And we have the problem in teaching German that we can't teach it the classical way nowadays, since all the language classrooms are mixed. So our German is evolving towards a German as a first/second language, German as a foreign language. And this will continue so, especially after the new wave of refugees from the Near Eastern countries. So in fact, this is changing. And I would wish for teachers of German having some outlook also on the other languages, you know, considering the other languages in their existence problem, etc. Going back to what the kids in their classrooms offer them. So in fact, when I say, let's go on teaching English as a first foreign language, which has been established in Europe for a long time, in fact. This is always based on, I hope I was clear on this point, this is always based on classroom experiences of the kids. So let us bring English and the other language into some kind of comparison.
Would you at any point introduce literacy in the mother tongue then? In the US, we talk about the social capital of having your mother tongue develop. That it, you know, there's research on it, how it maintains ties to the community, it's good for self-esteem. So is there any, in your plan, is there any place for developing literacy in the mother language, in the child's mother language for an immigrant child or a refugee child?
I would say let's do as much as is possible. But you know, if you have immigrants from countries like Afghanistan or Iraq, you have a different script, totally different, and of course you have this type of religious schooling which is alien to our European ways of schooling kids. And so you must get in touch, obviously, with the parents. You must get them round to bring their kids, say, on a Saturday and teach them literacy in their own language and following their cultural roots, which would be a very good thing. In Australia, this is being done, actually, in specialized weekend schools. And they function very, very well indeed. In the European countries, as far as I know them, there's very little in this field at the moment, so it would probably be a thing in several stages. But the idea is good, yes, definitely. And I go to the States quite often, so I know what's happening there. It's, it's a good thing, definitely. There's a lady over there.
Thank you very much for a brilliant talk, and I think the difficulty we have, of course, is that we always talk to the converted.
Yeah, sure.
And it's
Sure.
How is it that these ideas can actually go to the policymakers? So two very small comments and one question.
Yes.
Comment, Pompidou, what you said to Pompidou goes back completely to what happened in the French Revolution. And if you look at the 18th, 19th century description of trying to get rid of the regional languages, that's exactly the same.
Yeah, yeah.
Pompidou just
The old position.
Révolution
Yeah.
Française. The second thing is, I do have to sort of modify a bit what you said about Australia, having spent 30 years in Australia and being involved in the what they call community language.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, they're weekend schools, but it's not the weekend aspect and the intensity that makes the difference. The difference is that these languages, for the moment, 96 community languages, which you call in Europe heritage languages,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
actually can be offered to as part
Mhm.
completely
Mhm.
separated from the situation. So it's not the intensity of the weakness, it's the fact that they are fully recognized within a
Okay, thanks for that.
yeah.
That's,
And then
wonderful.
just my question, speaking, I mean, you are a teacher, I have been a teacher, well, I continue to be a teacher, but the major difficulty we find with trying to do something like that with teachers, and I do sympathize very much, and every time I talk about it, the answer is from them saying, we would like to do that, but ultimately, the regimes of assessment
Oh, yes.
do not allow us to go into that direction. So the point is, what is it that professional organizations can do to change the regimes of assessment?
Yeah.
Your
Okay, let me try and answer your question. Things are on the move, actually, at least in Germany. Freyo Meissner, my Gießen colleague, and myself, we are co-authors of the new educational standards brackets Germany for the A-level exam. And we put in Sprachbewusstheit, languages awareness, and Sprachlernkompetenz as two of the basic language learning competence, as two of the basic competencies for the Abitur, for the A-level. And this is now changing things. And I'm doing a lot of teacher retraining, and teachers come and say, well, how can this be done? We want to do it. Obviously, this is a good thing. It's in the standards, in the curriculum, so we must do it, but we want to do it as well. How can it be done? And then you talk to some of the publishers and say, oh no, we don't want to change our books, you know, it's too expensive. Ugh. So why not turn to English books, to books published in Britain, because they are far better than the stuff you get from Germany. Yeah.
Okay.
So this is a half an answer maybe. This may be different in other European countries. You know, we are not, well, we call ourselves a unit, but we are a wee little phoenix, not the big bird, you know.
Things only change in the long run.
Yeah.
We have 160,000 teachers of languages, foreign languages. Nobody knows how the teacher teaches. Nobody knows.
In a rotten way very often.
Sorry.
I try to ask my question in English.
Well, you can do...
No. In your talk, you mentioned a few times the concept of culture as very close to, very important for the teaching of English. Could you say a few words about this concept of culture in this context?
Culture.
Yeah, I think it's important when we talk about also English as a lingua franca, because it's a concept which is like culture without culture. And here culture is very important for the teaching of English. So what
Alors, si
what
vous
is...
enseignez l'anglais comme langue, comme première langue étrangère, je dirais qu'il faudrait toujours commencer par l'aspect européen. L'anglais britannique est une langue voisine, comme le français, comme beaucoup d'autres langues. Et c'est là une chose qui doit rester dans nos cervelles, hein, parce que très souvent, ce que nos professeurs disent, c'est « Oh, we teach English as an international language ». They don't know what international English is, actually. You go to a high-standard British language school and you can see what it is. It's very different from the stuff they teach, but they think they teach la langue internationale. So I'd be starting with British, UK culture, actually. Now, I've always told my students, who said, but again, there's so many things in this big bag. Well, you choose one region, like Northern England, the Southwest, if you like, Scotland, whatever, you know, and you make this the center of your cultural approach, or London, if you like. You make this the center of your cultural approach. You work from there. And then your kids will see, this lady, this gentleman, does not only speak the language, but he lives in it. He knows about what's happening in the way of an everyday culture, but also in the field of cultural history, which is very important, which our German students don't know anything about. And so he becomes, or they, the teachers, become more, well, what is it? I'm fishing for the German word now. Authentic, if you like, you see. And then I would go on and say, well, you know, an international culture has, of course, a problem. If you talk to the Hong Kong Chinese person, this Chinese person will bring in a bit of UK colonial culture, but also a lot of Chinese culture, Asian culture. Well, there's no Asian culture, Chinese culture, Chinese culture. But you don't know which is which. And so there is difficult there. And you need techniques to find out. But this is for the upper levels, I would say. You know? And in Hong Kong, it depends on whether you go to Hong Kong Island or to the other place across. You know, catch the ferry across, you find a different culture. Moulin.
Mais, Conrad, j'ai une toute petite question qui
Oui,
reste
certainement.
quand même
Par
par
français,
rapport à
mais-
ce que tu viens de dire. Je crois que pour l'anglais, je pense que Gredel parle des Englishes
Yeah.
du pluriel. Et quand on regarde l'anglais comme une langue internationale, il faut voir que tout l'Est asiatique, les Chinois, les Japonais, les Vietnamiens, etc., s'orientent plutôt sur l'anglais des États-Unis. C'est-à-dire que nous formons nos élèves par rapport au British English, parce que Great Britain est un voisin, un ami, etc., membre de l'Union européenne. Est-ce que nous nous orientons pas vers une direction qui limite l'efficacité il y a encore une petite remarque par rapport à l'espagnol. Nous avons un peu le même problème, parce que là aussi, est-ce que nous devons enseigner l'espagnol de Madrid, ou est-ce que nous devons enseigner plutôt l'espagnol de l'Andalousie ou de l'Amérique, une variété il y a seulement des variétés aux États-Unis, en Amérique c'est un continent immense. Qu'est-ce que nous devons faire? Nous avons besoin d'une norme quand même, parce qu'à un moment donné, il faut trancher, il faut dire ce qui est pas ça, que ça passe, je l'accepte, ou ça c'est plutôt mauvais. Malgré, je suis complètement d'accord avec ce que tu dis sur l'aspect fonctionnel de langue, d'enseigner les langues, etc. C'était ma question. Que faire avec la norme? What kind of English do we need?
Well, I would answer your question by saying we need an English that is acceptable all over the world. This can be British English, and this can be American, or Canadian English, or Australian English, or South African English.
What about Singapore English? What about
Singapore English. Singapore English is fairly neutral in many, as far as I can see, in many places.
It's not neutral. A language is never neutral.
This is theory. I'm a practitioner. I don't, look, if somebody comes from Singapore, I'll be going to Singapore in a few months' time, fourth time actually. I'm trying to figure out how it sounds. Of course, there will be the sound, there will be different words and tournure and all that. Well, he might say, well, I come from Singapore, so my English is slightly different, but, and then carry on. The problem with American English for some time in Eastern Asian states was that it was the lingo of the aggressors. They thought with the Vietnamese War and all that. But this is a thing of the past, fortunately. And then there is not the American English, there's general American, but, and it's obviously the language of a world power, definitely. But I think nowadays American English is acceptable all over the world, and so is British English. And both countries have a huge language industry. And this language industry also puts out people who speak the right kind of English. I'm very glad, actually, as a European, that Britain has this language industry, and that it is so bloody important, economically and by numbers. Because like this, you know, this is an important factor for the upkeep of European English in the world, definitely. But I'd always be going for acceptance. Acceptance is the thing. And if you feel that you are not accepted with the language you're speaking, as an adult at least you can do something about it if you have the right repair technique. I'd be going for repair techniques. We need them culturally anyhow.
Well, I have the impression it's really very interesting discussions where there's really more and more people who would like to talk, but my task this morning is to have a look a bit at the time. So I think I just stop our discussion now. You will have to be able to talk to him later in the break, and I think we should now continue with our next speaker. Thank you very much for your interesting presentation.
It's been a pleasure. Ça a été un plaisir, grand plaisir. Voilà.
Do you need do you have a USB stick or something? Where?
Your European keyboards are different.
Oh, right. Okay. Sorry. This one? Well, it's a French one. And I'm not French. It's different. So this is yours now?
It's this one.
Which one is it?
Angers.
This one.
How do I get it?
And now you can do it like this. Yeah, you just want to move.
So now I get it there, and so this will be 7.
Okay, we may just continue as our next speaker. Rosemary Solomoni just told me she's just going to talk about the same topic, so it's really great that we just continue the same morning, this session, with the same topics. And yeah, just as we're so very much advanced in our time, I just let you start.
Well, I said I wished I could continue the discussion. I just have to fix. Oh, sorry. This is okay. I wish I could continue the discussion, and I would be willing to cede my talk if we could. But I guess I'm here to follow a certain script and a certain topic, and so I will do it. But certainly I would answer questions that carry over from the previous speaker, because I just thought that whole perspective was one that sometimes in my presentations in Europe I feel like I'm the only voice crying in the desert on those issues of regional languages, immigrant languages, now refugee children. And I was a bit surprised over the past 2 days that I didn't hear very much of that. I don't know if I heard anything, maybe once, of one speaker even mention the refugee crisis in Europe, and like it is just such a powerful movement and an issue that has to be dealt with in a very immediate way in terms of educating children. Just as a little preface, very often in Europe, somebody says to me, well, what is a law professor doing talking about language rights and about what goes on in the classroom? So I always have to explain a bit. My background originally was in linguistics. I have a PhD in linguistics and education from Columbia University. And while I was working on the doctorate, I taught English to foreign students in Columbia's American language program. So these were students coming in from other countries, preparing them to speak English, to learn English, and then going into the various graduate programs there. I also ran bilingual education programs in New York City, in the New York City public schools for French, Haitian, Italian, and Spanish-speaking students. So I have this background in bilingual education and in English as a foreign language education. And then immediately after the PhD, I went to law school. So, and kind of the rest is history. And left I left in terms of my own research the idea of language rights behind in a kind of sad way because I didn't want to. But the issues were just not ripe at that time. I really wanted to write about language policy in Europe, but it just wasn't here yet. And so I went off into teaching constitutional law and administrative law and children in the law, and my writing has been largely on education rights and schooling. And so in more recent years, I have come back. I wrote a book on immigrant children and language and identity in immigrant children, kind of drawing from my experience when I was younger in working in those very poor immigrant communities in New York. And then the last chapter of the book was on Europe. So I saw myself going back into Europe of what I wanted to do originally. And so the book I'm writing now is on global English, which is kind of taking me full circle around. And so what I'm going to talk about today can you, okay. What I'm going to talk about today is a court case that I've been watching for the past 2 years. One of the good points about speaking at the end of a conference is that you have all the wisdom of what everybody else has said. And one of the bad points is that some of the speakers have said what you had planned to say. So, and even Julie Dearden yesterday used one of the quotes from one of the parties that I've been talking to, and he's really been a great source for me in the Polytechnic litigation. We've been corresponding, and I met with him in May. And I could have chosen any of the other quote from Emilio Matriciani, and Julie chose the same quote because it was just so good. And some of the data that I have, Michele Gazzola had shown you yesterday. But so thinking about it, I think what my talk does is kind of wrap things up in a way that I'm hitting a bunch of themes that other speakers have hit upon. So hopefully it won't be too repetitive, and that there'll be something new. And certainly, I think the Polytechnic University litigation is new because we really haven't been talking about Italy at all. Maybe Michele mentioned it a bit. So in any event, just looking at this whole issue of English medium instruction and English in universities. I think it's probably the most visible and controversial issue of English around. It seems to provoke the most controversy. The way I came into it was 2 years ago. Just around the same time, you had the legislation, the Fioraso law in France, and then you had this Polytechnic litigation in Italy, and it was just within a day. The law in France was adopted, and the regional administrative court decision in the Polytechnic University litigation comes up. The court decides the first level. So it was really just within a day of each other. And so I had written some small pieces on that in University World News and Inside Higher Education, some opinion pieces that turned ultimately into an article that's coming out. But that's really how I entered the whole issue of global English, and then I saw this is something that Americans aren't talking about. I have learned that Europeans are talking about it a lot, there's just a lot on it. But Americans are not talking about it or really thinking about the role of English and how it's, how it's washing across the globe and what the consequences are for other countries and other parts of the world, and particularly Europe. And so looking at this whole idea of internationalization of higher ed, part of it has to do with globalization, as some of you have mentioned, and the way internationalization has come in as a series of strategies in which to work out, to develop what globalization is at the university level. And so internationalization becomes like an organizing concept for developing globalization. But what you also have, and I think maybe one speaker had mentioned, the Bologna process. And the Bologna process seemed in some ways sort of hits head on with the idea of internationalization and English in a kind of peculiar way. Because the Bologna process is promoting harmonization, uniformity across education, across European higher education. But it's also suggesting, I think that's not thought about much, it's also suggesting that universities not just recognize but respect cultural and linguistic diversity. So it's not just uniformity and consistency, there's also an aspect of diversity in there. But there's this whole confluence of forces that are placing a number of pressures on universities now and really challenging longstanding traditions and the whole concept of national identity. So first, as we've been talking about for the past 2 days, from the institutional perspective, there's the problem of declining demographics. And when you have declining demographics, then you have declining enrollments. So what do institutions do about that? So they begin filling the gap by recruiting international students, many of whom now speak English, but with varying degrees of fluency. They're not all equally fluent in English. And there are about 4 million of these students in the world. So this is a very lucrative market for institutions, and I've seen my own institution now developing LLM programs, Masters in Law programs. My dean at this point right now is in China, recruiting students from China. We've recruited students from Saudi Arabia too, but it is a way to internationalize, to increase your reputation, but also to deal with declining demographics and a declining enrollment. University administrators also look toward increasing or enhancing their reputation through university rankings. Now, rankings depend to some degree on the number of international students and the faculty recruited, who in turn are drawn to certain schools because they have a world-class status. So that just it keeps feeding upon itself. The more a school rises in reputation, then the more students you recruit, and the more it rises in reputation, and so on. But I have to say that in the United States, I've seen ever since U.S. News and World Report started ranking universities, I think it was around the early 1980s, there's really been a perverse effect on the way decisions are made at the university level. Decisions are made, like priorities are changed based upon the rankings. There's a lot of gaming the system with the numbers. You know exactly how many points go for, in the law school world, it's academic reputation. It's your reputation among judges. It's your median grade point average. It's your median score on the entrance exams, on what we call the LSAT. And so if you know what weight is given to any of those criteria, that's where you put your resources to start upping those numbers to ultimately increase where you are in the rankings. And so it's not necessarily to the good of the institution. Sometimes it really distorts the mission of the institution. It's not necessarily with the benefit of students in mind. So I really understand, I've seen it in the US, how rankings can have a perverse effect, although you can argue that they're also consumer oriented. I know as a mother, in looking at colleges for my son, well, you go to the rankings and you see, which are the highest ranking schools and which is the one you're going to get into of, the highest ranking, and so a lot of the market is driven by that. So in addition to the institutional needs in terms of internationalization, you also have faculty members. And and all this comes into, you'll see in the Polytechnic litigation, how all these issues really surface very clearly in this court case and the court decision. So you have faculty members who are concerned about remaining relevant in the stream of scholarship. And in a stream of scholarship that's conducted very largely in English, especially in the sciences. As many of you know, prestigious journals, even journals with foreign names, are accepting manuscripts only in English, which sounds rather peculiar. You also have academic conferences that are held more and more only in English. English has become the common language, the functional language for many people, between people, and this was mentioned by one speaker, who are not non-native speakers speaking to each other in English. And so we see English being increasingly disengaged from any particular country, whether it be the United States or whether it be Britain or Canada or Australia. We see it becoming increasingly disengaged from the culture of these countries as well. And we do talk about many Englishes. I know that's a contentious concept, and no one's quite sure what that means or whether there's any standard of proficiency we're looking at in this concept of many Englishes. But the idea that English is being used as a lingua franca among academics, I mean, that's just a reality. Just last week, I gave a talk in Trento, in Italy, in the north of Italy, which was very much like Konrad Schroeder's talk today, dealing with those issues of these European documents on multilingualism and mother tongue plus two, and what the implications are for refugee children, immigrant children, et cetera, and regional languages. I was the only native English speaker at this conference, yet the conference was held in English. And it wasn't, it wasn't just for my benefit. This was the common language amongst this group of, it was constitutional law professors and linguists getting together to talk about these issues. So we have the interests of the institution, the interests of the faculty, the interests of the students. Students want to increase their options for jobs abroad. They really believe that English, and it does have capital in the global market. This is a knowledge economy, and students, it's very clear to students. There was an article in The Economist about maybe a year or two ago that pointed out how multinational companies across the globe are conducting business almost exclusively in English. There was also a global survey back in 2012 whereby recruiters and human resource managers were reporting that excellent English earned job seekers 30 to 50% higher salary. So English has a monetary value on the job market. At Milan's elite polytechnic university, which I'm going to talk about, what the administrators there tell me is that 70% of job offers, even in Italy, even within Italy, require a good knowledge of English. So this is local market data. Michele Gazzoli yesterday was talking about it's global data in terms of the job market. This was really local data that the folks at Politecnico were giving me as to what Italian employers are looking for. And so universities are responding to all these needs in terms of internationalization and working using English taught courses as the vehicle for getting into internationalization. This is some data I think that Michele had given. No, maybe not. No, it wasn't. It's another slide. But if you look at this slide here, you see between December of 2011 and June of 2013, that was just a space of a year and a half. What you see in the top 10 host countries, the numbers of European masters that were being taught entirely in English, and you see the jump from about 4,600 to about 6,400 in a year and a half. And that's a 38% jump in the number, and this is just the top 10 countries. The Netherlands and Germany led the way in overall numbers. The sharpest increase was in the Scandinavian countries, where some universities are now offering all their programs, their graduate education in English. In France, the increase was 43%, and in Italy, it was a staggering 60%. But you have to understand that if you look at the numbers across, Italy began at a very low point at 191 programs, and this is in a country with a population of 60 million people. So you have to put the increase in Italy in that perspective. No, it's the wrong way. Okay. Most of these programs were in business, economics, engineering, and technology. You could see business and economics at 28%, engineering and technology at 21%. But even with, let me give you another slide. I think this is what Michele had yesterday. If you look at all English taught programs by region, just classifying them by region, you can see that the largest increase between 2007 and 2014 was in southwestern European countries and in the Baltics for obvious reasons of moving away from German onto. English, but they also started again at the lowest numbers. Even with these gains, in 2014, the Nordic countries at 60.6% still outpaced the Southwest at 17.2% in the proportion of institutions offering English taught courses. The same study, and this is data you were given yesterday too, the same study gathered data from project coordinators and program directors and found the following to be the primary stated reasons for offering English taught courses. So you had removing language obstacles for the enrollment of foreign students, trying to attract more foreign students because they speak English, improving intercultural competencies of their domestic students, enhancing the international profile of the institution, compensating for institutional shortages like a lack of domestic students, insufficient income base, and brain gain. Recruiting international faculty, but also recruiting international students as a future workforce. And these really vary by country. And some of it, as some of us were talking about last evening at dinner, some of it has to do with visa requirements too, how easy it is for foreign students to enter countries for educational purposes. These concerns weigh heavily not only at administrators, but on the EU itself. There really is an understandable fear within the EU that Europe might lose its 45% share of these mobile learners to mounting competition from Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America. And yesterday I had raised the point with Asia. I'm not so sure. When I look at numbers I see reported, it's just numbers reported in the press. But as Chinese institutions in particular are offering more courses in English, and as they are improving their international rankings relative to, and they are, I mean, when the new rankings just came out this month, and you could see more Asian institutions and Chinese institutions are moving to the top ranks, and the United States is going down relative to other countries, even though it's still on top. More students from China are staying home. I saw some numbers that indicated the numbers of Chinese students, college students studying abroad is going down. The numbers of Chinese students at the secondary school level studying abroad is going up. That more parents want their children at the secondary level a lot was in the United States, to sending them to the United States, hoping that they would get into Harvard or initially. I'm not sure that's always possible. But as of 2003, the European Commission added yet another layer to what is already this very intense debate. And the Commission made separate calls, one for internationalizing higher education, and the other for maintaining instructional quality. And so, carried out through Global English, these two objectives are not necessarily consistent with each other. It really depends on institutional objectives. You know, what is the objective of why is this institution or why is this program moving on to quote unquote internationalization and using English taught programs to work toward internationalization. Sometimes I wonder if the institutions themselves are really think it through, know why they're moving toward internationalization, other than it's going to increase our rankings. The openness of the planning process, and all this comes out in the Polytechnic litigation. The timeline for implementation, linguistic supports for students and faculty proficiency in English. And so to demonstrate that point, I'm going to focus on this pending court case from the Polytechnic Institution in Milan and the ramifications, the consequences of this litigation, whether they be direct or indirect, because they really could be far-reaching. They could be far-reaching in a very legal sense within Italy, for higher education in Italy, but the momentum of that case could have some indirect effect on English taught programs in other countries as well. So, and it's a case again that I've been watching for about 2 years, corresponding with the actors in this drama. Reading, I've learned more about the Italian court system in the past 2 years than I ever thought I would. So reading the court documents that they've been sending me, reading through newspaper articles, actually going to Milano in May and interviewing the parties on both sides, you know, representatives of the administration, students and faculty, and hearing what they had to say in a very first-hand way. So back in February of 2011, the rector of Milan's Polytechnic University proposed that by the academic year 2014-15, which was last year, all master's and doctoral level courses would be taught in English. So what the administration was trying to do, they were trying to build consensus, again, going to the openness of the planning process. And so the rector held multiple meetings with the faculty senate and an open forum for faculty and students. He was trying to get people to co-opt all the stakeholders into this decision and his vision for the institution. The academic senate voted by a very large margin. It was 28-1, ultimately, after much discussion, in favor of the plan. The university's doctoral students also very enthusiastically endorsed the plan. But there were other students who raised very serious concerns about this 2-year timeline. So they were concerned about the timeline itself. They were concerned about the proficiency of faculty members in English. They were concerned about their own insecurities in speaking English. And you could see this. There's a video of this on YouTube that I found quite by mistake, by accident. And it's there. You could see it. And so you see the rector sitting there answering questions of the students. It was totally a student forum. And you could see their concerns being raised. It's all in Italian, so you would have to understand Italian. But it really is a very powerful example of how this process, how the process goes. So ultimately, there was a very small but vocal minority, about 285 faculty members, who signed a petition and presented it to the rector, and they were opposing the plan. So here's the quote from Emilio Matriciani. And he's really, I guess you would say, the leader of the opposition, the most vocal person, and he's a key person. He's been my contact person in terms of receiving all the court documents. And so Emilio says, the point is not English, but rather than English being imposed on students as a kind of linguistic dictatorship, and what we might call low-definition English, the English of conferences and so on, and is also being confused with the high-definition language of teaching. And what was interesting for me is initially when I saw the reporting in the press of this litigation, I thought, well, probably these are professors who don't speak English well themselves, and that's why they're feeling insecure about this plan, but that wasn't the case. These were people who really spoke English quite well, and I realized it when I met them. And even in the correspondence was, you know, I kept telling them, well, I'm corresponding in English, but you can correspond back to me in Italian, I'll understand it, and they kept corresponding in English, in perfect English. So that wasn't the case, that it was difficult for them to teach in English. It was really the principle, a whole bunch of factors that were playing in here that led to the opposition. But despite the petition, the university held firm in its position. And for the university, English is no longer a wave of the future. They really feel, and the rector does, that this is an imperative of the present, that they have no choice. Talking to the administration, they have no choice but to move on to English teaching. So I'll give you a quote from the university rector, Giovanni Azzone. He says, for European universities, the risk of not moving forward in English is to remain stuck in the middle between Anglo-Saxon countries, which represent the traditional leaders in education, and the Asian countries whom our young people believe represent the future. So this is like a mission for him to move these graduate programs onto English. The opposing faculty remained equally resolute as the administration, and so just about 100 of them decided to take the case to court. They're represented in the litigation by one of their own professors, Maria Agustina Cabidou. She's a Sardinian, and she's a lawyer. She teaches administrative law there, and she's a firebrand, and she's the one who's representing them in the litigation. The events surrounding this litigation, and especially the administrative court decision, really provide this interesting, fascinating context for teasing out all these important cultural and legal issues that reach beyond national borders. It's not just about, when you look at the court decision, this is not just about Italy, although when you see it's based, the legal interpretation is based on Italian constitutional law and Italian statutory law, but what's really going on here is just the more general tension within this debate over English medium instruction. And so it's really a case, I believe, that students and faculty and policymakers really should be watching very carefully to see what the court does with it. And if you look, what really is the ultimate question that this litigation is trying to answer? And it's really about how universities can compete on an international level while still preserving their academic integrity and their national identity. That's really at stake here. It's internationalization, it's reputation versus academic integrity and national identity. So, and to fully comprehend what's going on here, you really have to consider the setting of what Politecnico is really about. They consider themselves the premier technological institution within Italy. It was founded back in 1863. It covers 7 campuses spread throughout Lombardy in northern Italy. The main campus is in Milan. It's a flagship institution for engineering, industrial design, and architecture. It counts among its alumni about 1/3 of Italy's architects. It's state funded. It educates about 40,000 students spread across these campuses. It has an academic staff of about 1,400. And by the time the plan was adopted, about 30% of their graduate programs were already taught, their courses were already taught in English. But the same courses were also taught in Italian. And what was happening is that the Italian students really favored the Italian courses, whereas the international students did not. They didn't take any of the Italian courses because they didn't have fluency in Italian. And so the situation inevitably created these two academically but socially separate streams where Italian and foreign students seldom met. It was like two populations in the school, and they just didn't have anything to do with each other. As a student from one of the Gulf states stated, he could have had the same experience in Dubai. So that he had nothing of an Italian experience in learning English through English in this program. But for such a high prestige Italian university to suddenly decide that it was going to convert all their graduate programs into English was really momentous. So, other institutions around Italy are really watching this. Is this a recipe for success? Is it a model for success? Or really is it a recipe for failure? How is this ultimately going to shake out? The plan, in fact, included a number of measures in order to help it get off the ground effectively. International master's students would be required to take 10 of their 120 credits in Italian language and literature and culture. That has not happened. The last discussion I had over the summer was that the Faculty Senate was considering it. They were discussing it, but it hasn't happened yet. So there's no requirement of Italian for the foreign students. The university would offer an intensive English language training program run by an outside contractor for professors and administrative staff. That they did do. The faculty would be allowed to spend a semester abroad to develop English competency in their area of expertise. The school would allocate 3.2 million euros to cover the cost of English-speaking instructors. It began to recruit native English speakers for the permanent faculty with a goal of reaching 20% non-Italians among the faculty. And initially, visiting professors would cover many of these courses. Well, that takes us to May of 2003 and the Regional Administrative Court decision. The ruling striking down the plan really came as a surprise to the university. I don't think they expected it. But what I found even more remarkable, other than the bottom line of the court's ruling, was the court's rationale. The opinion, in fact, captured the whole essence of university life. In reading court opinions for a lot of years now, I have never seen a court opinion so rich in an understanding of the policy area that it was really dealing with. It really, to me, it was like a masterpiece of judicial reasoning with a very clear sensitivity to the interests at stake. And that's why I found it so fascinating, the context of it, to tease out what's really going on here with English medium instruction. And what it does is it weaves together law and policy, and it draws on universal principles of fairness, freedom of expression, and equality. The narrative is very tightly reasoned. It just goes really quickly. And I wondered who really wrote this. Did the judges really understand this? And then I read the brief that was submitted by the attorney for the plaintiffs, and I saw that she herself had written just a remarkable brief that was very rich in all these aspects of university life and of language. She herself understood language, and the judges were really getting it from the brief. So it looks at institutional governance, self-governance, the rights of faculty members to teach, the rights of students to learn, the importance of language to teaching and learning, and the link between language on the one hand and thought and culture on the other. This is not typically the kind of things that you would see in a legal opinion. So beginning with the legal claims, the court acknowledged that Italian is not expressly the official language of Italy. That if you look at Article 6 of the Constitution, it talks about the rights of linguistic minorities, that the Republic safeguards linguistic minorities by means of appropriate measures. And what the court says is that the constitutional court in Italy has repeatedly confirmed that this it really implicitly safeguards Italian and recognizes its official status, even though it doesn't clearly expressly state that. But there were also several statutes, several legislative declarations that indirectly support the claim. And so you have this 1999 law that says the official language of the Republic is Italian. So it's in statutory law, but it's not in the Constitution, in their social contract. You have this 1933 law, which was really from the fascist era, that says that the Italian language is the official language of all teaching and examinations in all university establishments. But this is, put yourself in the Mussolini mindset, and you can understand that. Then you have this 2010 law. And although the 2010 law allows university courses in a foreign language to promote international careers, the court made very clear that internationalization could not marginalize Italian in favor of other languages. This is the way the court interpreted this language in the statutory law. The court said, and I italicized and underlined the word also, the court said the use of the word also in the law was significant. And that what follows also, according to the court, is merely a suggestion of possible ways to internationalize education programs. So it really turned on statutory, what we would call statutory construction, statutory interpretation. Looked at that way, internationalization, the court said, could be achieved without necessarily offering courses in a foreign language. In fact, according to the court, the law required that any new courses in a foreign language had to supplement and not supplant courses in Italian. And this is an interpretation that the university is strongly contesting, because you could understand how expensive that would become. So at the baseline, the court was disputing whether the plan actually promoted internationalization in the graduate program, as the university was arguing, or was it merely targeting instruction in a particular language and a particular culture, i.e. English, while exacting a very deep cost on Italian. So we just take internationalization as a given going through English, but the court was questioning that you could achieve internationalization in other ways, not just through one language and one culture. In any case, the court concluded that this totalistic nature of the program, all graduate programs in 2 years onto English, would really undermine the Italian language, both as a means of communication and as a vehicle for transmitting understandings and cultural values important to the Italian people and to the Italian state, kind of going to what Conrad Schroeder was talking about earlier today, that the communicative aspect, but the cultural aspect of language as well. But even accepting the university's arguments on internationalization, the court found that it went way beyond what was necessary. And this was a concept they were taking from international law, this idea of proportionality, that the plan itself was out of proportion to what the needs would be for internationalization. And the court said the ultimate effect was to relegate the Italian language and the faculty members who were not proficient in Italian to basic courses in the undergraduate program. So understand, if you couldn't speak Italian well and all the graduate courses were being taught in English, well then you were foreclosed from teaching in those courses and you only could teach at the undergraduate level. And so that was denying them their academic freedom, their freedom to teach. And so in the eyes of the judges, the plan lacked, quote unquote, proportionality. Here the court, missing something here. No, there's something. Oh, well, okay, let me go on. Here the court directly linked the freedom to teach in the Italian Constitution to the faculty members' choice in using the language. The court said some faculty members are going to have to forego the more advanced courses, and those are the courses that would really utilize their skills. And as all of you know, that your teaching informs your scholarship, and your scholarship informs your teaching. There's really a symbiotic relationship between the two. But even the court said even those who agree to teach in English would have to revamp their syllabi, revamp their course materials in line with English. And while some of the graduate students would be very eager to learn in English, there were others who were very reluctantly abandoning their native language, and particularly in their areas of specialization. So you had the rights of the faculty to teach and the rights of the students to learn. The court zeroed in on the language question. Now let me see if I can find this. It's not coming up. No, okay. No. Okay, let me go forward. In zeroing on the language question, the court opened the discussion to the nature of language learning, the role of language in the university classroom, and the potential effect on instructional quality. And so as the court noted, and this was really interesting for the court to say, mere proficiency in the language doesn't necessarily mean competency to teach in the language effectively, nor does it necessarily mean effective learning. And the reasoning of the court really makes sense to anybody who understands anything about language teaching and learning. The court really made sense. Though many of the professors, if you look at it, many of the professors may publish in Italian, especially in the sciences, and may be familiar with the terminology in their own discipline, the technical terms, they're not necessarily able to convey fluid thoughts in an academic lecture or in an unscripted class discussion. Of course, that doesn't mean that those skills can't be learned with time and practice and exposure. But students would face similar challenges, the court said. Learning through the medium of a foreign language requires more than just conversational skills that we would learn in a conventional language class. It demands the capacity to comprehend the spoken word within a very broad academic vocabulary, and to reformulate, apply, and critique those thoughts in writing, at times under pressure of testing conditions. So for students who lack the capacity in English, whether it be native students or exchange students at Polytech, they had a lot of Chinese students. In classes I visited, there seemed to be a lot of Chinese students there. For the international students in particular, the quality of their education was going to diminish. And it could be that they were getting less than what was originally promised them in terms of the international experience. These consequences run, at least in part, at cross currents with the European Commission report, calling for universities to improve the quality of teaching and learning, so to produce, quote, critically thinking, creative, and adaptable graduates. The issues also vary by discipline, and I'll show you that. For example, the president of Polytechnic School of Architecture argued that English is not the dominant language in the field of architecture, that certain Italian classics are fundamental to educating future professionals, and that few of them have been translated into Italian. So if learning in Italian is no longer offered, and international students have no opportunity to read those books, those works in Italian, then you have to wonder what's the added value of studying architecture in Italy, and why not study it in any other country. But on the other hand, the same problems didn't arise in civil engineering, and in civil engineering, now all of their courses are in English. Another example is the School of Urban Planning within Polytech. And this story came to me from a professor from another university who refused to, she was invited to participate on a doctoral dissertation panel, and she refused to. And when I interviewed her, she said to me, well, you know, I do regional planning, and my research really has to be accessible to the people. We're a publicly supported university, and so we have an obligation. We're paid by the taxpayers, and we have a public obligation to produce information and knowledge that the public has access to. And if the public, all the public, doesn't have the ability to read our material, our findings in English, then we're not meeting our responsibility, you know, to the public. In any event, getting back to the litigation, and I have to wrap up, the Faculty Senate voted to appeal. It goes to the next level at the appeals court. The Faculty Senate itself said, you know, we're just not going to lie down and die. We want to take this even further. The appeals court says to them, you have to consider offering parallel classes. Well, that could be extraordinarily expensive. There's a really high price tag on that. So what the university did is it had each of the programs make its own decision as to how many courses for the following year would go on to English. And this is what I have here. What ended up in 2014-15 last year, 24 exclusively in English, 8 in both English and Italian, and 8 exclusively in Italian. When the court finally made its decision, it said there are really constitutional questions here. We have to send it off to the Constitutional Court and let the Constitutional Court decide whether this plan was really in conformity with certain provisions in the Italian Constitution, being Article 3, equality based on language, Article 6, the rights of linguistic minorities, and again, Article 33, the freedom to teach. But I'd like to get to this whole idea of language rights and responsibilities across education. When we look at the measures that were taken by Polytech, some of them you could argue maybe it was too little too late or too much too soon. Trying to bring university professors on, hiring outsiders. Are they really, if you're hiring visiting professors, well, what about all the young professors, academics in Italy who are looking for jobs in a very tight job market? Are you really denying them the opportunity to teach in Italian? So it really was not a win-win situation. Looking at English proficiency of faculty and foreign students, the problems there, rights of faculty to teach, rights of students to learn. Training and managing a multicultural classroom. These professors, and I think it's been intimated here, particularly this morning, that it's not just about the faculty knowing how to speak English, but how do they manage a multicultural classroom itself in order to develop cultural competency in these students as well. The idea of English language instruction in primary and secondary education, what I've tried to do in my research is drill down from higher education as to whether what was happening in Italy here as in other countries is that they don't have the linguistic infrastructure within primary and secondary school to prepare these students to take courses in English at the university level. So what's really happening within European nations themselves in terms of teaching children at the primary and secondary level English and developing that linguistic infrastructure. What about marginalized stakeholders, regional language speakers, children from immigrant families, the economically disadvantaged? How do they all play then into the offering of English at the primary and secondary level, that there really has to be equal access for these children as well? And what about multiple language skills, that English cannot do it all? And so, and that gets to equity concerns as well. Is it just, what I've seen in European countries is that most children are not learning mother tongue +2 as per the European Union multilingualism agenda. What I see is most children are learning English plus bilingualism, English plus their official language. But you do have parents who are more affluent, who have the economic means to send their children to English language classes, and this is happening. And that creates these collateral negative consequences for disadvantaged children, minority children, and children who speak regional languages. There's this report that was commissioned by the EU back in 2011, Languages for Jobs, and it talks about how English is now becoming just a basic language, and that you really have, in order to prepare children for the job market, they have to be learning other languages and not just English. Again, English cannot do it all. And so if we look at European secondary students, whether or not they are learning 2 or more languages, there's data showing that the percentages are going down, that fewer are learning 2 or more languages. Again, it's just basically English plus bilingualism. And so what I pose at the end are these questions based on academic governance. You know, what should be the role of the National Education Ministry in setting standards for English medium instruction on universities? Should there be a role? What should be the role of the national legislature in setting standards? Most but not all of your countries are more centralized than we are. Certainly in the U.S., our education system is very decentralized. And what about the role of the judiciary? Here we have the court intervening, you can argue, in academic governance. And coming from a legal and political system where we value academic autonomy and federalism and separation of powers amongst the branches of government, this to me it's kind of struck me as what can really be done here, and whether this is the appropriate role of the court to intervene in the way that it has, although the court is really affirming a lot of thoughts I've had on the issues. And then finally, what's the implication for Anglo-speaking countries, this whole idea of English washing over the globe? All of you are becoming much more multilingual than the Anglo countries are. I mean, we have, I think, in the U.S. an agenda of monolingualism. And so when you look at the data in the U.S., only 7% of university students are enrolled in a foreign language course. The numbers have dramatically declined over the years. Only 25% of adults even claim that they speak a second language, and many of them were learning it at home, not in school. And so what I've argued is I think that all of you are getting to understand us more than we understand you, because you really can't access a people and their values in translation. You really have to go through the native language. So I think there's really an Anglo language deficit here, that English washing over the globe. Ultimately, I think the Anglo countries are going to be the ones on the short end of the stick. And then finally, summing up, that the move toward English language instruction is not a zero-sum game. There inevitably are winners and losers. And as the court was saying in the Polytechnico case, it all demands caution, a sense of balance, and good judgment. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Italian universities, or are you talking about its impact on what universities in other European countries might do, and to what extent would therefore there need to be some kind of involvement of the judiciary at European level?
At the EU level?
Yeah, because